Hello and welcome to the Islamic Finance Show. The UK has played an enthusiastic role in launching Islamic finance into the mainstream, yet many commentators are beginning to notice a slowdown and possible stagnation. In today's show, we will not only be taking a look at the success and benefits of Islamic finance in the UK, but also the challenges the industry is now facing in achieving wider uptake and long-term effectiveness. So, let's get right into it and welcome back our guest on the show, Harris Irfan, a leading Islamic finance banker and the author of the acclaimed Heaven's Bankers book. Good to have you here again, Harris. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So let's get right into it. Islamic finance has, over the last decade or so, attracted a lot of attention and a lot of praise here in the UK, with David Cameron's Sukuk announcement in 2013 at the World Islamic Economic Forum, combined with the Islamic Finance Task Force that was established. It seems like Islamic finance has become a real integral part of the London economy. Now, perhaps you could tell us a bit about the relationship between Islamic finance and why London's been so good to Islamic finance, and perhaps vice versa, why Islamic finance has become so important for London.
Well, I think the great thing about London is it is one of the world's great cities. And because it's one of the world's great cities, it attracts some of the best talent. It's in the middle of time zones, so it's a natural financial centre for time zones far in the east and far in the west. And you've got, within a very small area, the square mile, you've got access to a huge number of very high quality service providers, law firms, accountants, banks, other types of financial institutions. So all of this on your doorstep in one concentrated place. It's no wonder that whenever anything innovative happens in finance or commerce, chances are London has got something to do with it. So we've seen London, the big banks that are established in London, export teams all around the world in Islamic finance, which is surprising given that the natural centres are places where there are large Muslim populations, countries like Malaysia or the UAE or Saudi Arabia. So it's become one of the world's Islamic finance centres. But I think you're right in saying that there's been a sort of state of stagnation. And I think that's often more a function of the wider financial services industry and less to do specifically with Islamic finance itself. So there's some great things about London that means it's well set up to offer Islamic finance services. You mentioned the Islamic Finance Task Force, for example. That's done fantastic work setting up a regulatory environment that actually works and can help to encourage and allow Islamic finance to play on a level playing field against other conventional financial sources. So there's a lot of great things that make London a centre, or one of the centres for Islamic finance.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Islamic Finance Task Force and the work that they're doing. We'll come back to exactly what they've done and how much they have to do with the stagnation later on. But what I'm quite curious about is, during the time of this rapid growth of Islamic finance in London, the Financial Times spoke about this thrill that the financial insiders felt as Islamic finance was really rising. Now, that was interesting to me because I thought to myself, why are they thrilled unless they're seeing something really new or getting access to something that they don't already have access to? So what is it about Islamic finance that is thrilling these insiders, these financial veterans, that perhaps traditional finance, which has been in this capital for hundreds of years, what is it that Islamic finance is bringing to the table that perhaps traditional finance isn't?
Well, it took us several years to convince the British government, and this is a lot of different areas of lobbying that was done to try and convince the British government that they ought to issue an Islamic bond, a Sharia-compliant bond called a Sukuk.
Right.
And
that's like a traditional bond for the
governments finance themselves using conventional bonds. They issue these pieces of paper in the financial market, which are debt instruments, and they pay an interest payment. That's typically how governments will finance themselves. But
I mean, that's a large scale, isn't it?
A huge scale, billions and billions,
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this Sukuk was only like a drop in the ocean. It was what, approximately
200 million pounds, yes. So it was a drop in the ocean, and that was a huge disappointment, let me be honest, because having spent several years trying to convince the British government, when they eventually decided to do it, there were two things that made us less thrilled than we could have been. One of them was that it was a small issuance, £200 million. Might sound like a big number, but it's actually very, very small when you compare it against other so-called benchmark-size issuances, which are £1 billion or £2 billion or £3 billion. The other thing is that it was not, they didn't select one of the domestic champions one of the 5 British Islamic banks to be one of the lead arrangers. This is the managers of the issuance, the guys who actually create the piece of paper and sell it in the market.
Sure.
So I think they probably missed a trick there, because all that lobbying, or much of that lobbying, was done by the domestic champions. So to then turn around and give it to one of the usual suspects, HSBC and Standard Chartered,
Which was the case, yeah.
Which was the case, is kind of unfair. And I think that was a lost opportunity, because had they selected one of those domestic champions, we probably wouldn't have seen the rate of stagnation that we have seen. Because now the market doesn't really see Islamic banks, or the wider conventional market doesn't see the Islamic banks in the UK as being, full-service participants in the market. It's just a niche area for niche customers.
I mean, coming back to that, I mean, it was such a lucrative opportunity, particularly with the investments that we now see tangibly in the London skyline that seem to be funded by the Islamic finance. I think the Shard, one of the most sort of famous ones, was part funded, if I'm correct.
Correct, yes.
With Sukuk, and there were a couple of others as well.
Yes.
Battersea Power Station.
Correct, yes.
And part of Canary Wharf as well, I think. What I'm interested in is, back to the question that we started with, why Sukuk and not traditional debt-based finance?
Well, for a start, a lot of the investors who wanted to buy into these iconic landmarks like the Shard were from the Middle East. And therefore many of them were Sharia-compliant institutions themselves. So they wouldn't be able to invest in those assets unless they were financed on a Sharia-compliant basis. Hence why you've seen tranches of Sharia-compliant financing in these large transactions. So I think that's been very positive. This foreign direct investment has helped to not only shape the London skyline, but also has introduced Islamic investors into the UK from typically Malaysia or Qatar or the UAE. And that's been very beneficial. But that isn't the full story. I mean, we haven't seen much movement away from London. We've seen Manchester has received a lot of attention from Middle Eastern investors. There was a very small, privately placed sukuk for an engineering company in the northeast of England. But outside of London, it really hasn't been a huge impact across the nation.
Still within London, you mentioned the attraction of investments from foreign interests. Perhaps, what part do you think the UK's legal framework, an existing framework that it's had for hundreds of years, what impact does it have really on the measure of success we might have in attracting foreign interest in Islamic finance? Islamic finance, essentially what I'm saying, can it really be successful in the UK with that sort of a framework?
One of the reasons why Islamic finance has been successful relatively in this country is because of the legal framework. We have a robust, well-precedented legal environment where investors have certainty when things go wrong. So they can be sure that the courts in this country will treat them fairly. And that is a big attraction.
To stop you there, Harry, I mean, things do go wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, let's not jump over that.
Yeah.
They absolutely do. And I think in the West, we have plenty of examples. And one of the interesting things throughout the downturn that was experienced in the West was that Islamic finance showed real resilience throughout that period because of its asset-based structure. Now, do you think that... Now, when I'm referring to the framework here in the UK, I'm not necessarily saying the accountability that we hold on people too, but rather, can a framework that's not Sharia-based truly allow a Sharia-based finance model to provide unique offerings?
Yes, I honestly believe that's the case. There hasn't been a conflict between English law and Sharia law that hasn't been resolved. So you'll often hear this sort of myth that Sharia law is incompatible with Western values, and this is just nonsense. Actually...
Why?
Well, I mean, if you look at the English legal framework, we see concepts like agency and trust law and endowment. One of Oxford University's oldest colleges was founded on the basis of an endowment, which, if you read it, the language looks remarkably similar, word for word almost, compared to similar endowments in the Islamic world around the sort of 10th and 11th century. So that suggests to me that much of the law in England and elsewhere has borrowed heavily from surrounding cultures, and Islam is one of those cultures. So actually, when we talk about fairness and justice and equality under English law, we're also talking about fairness and justice and equality under Sharia law. And there's this sort of myth that there's a contradiction between the two. There haven't been any court cases where there have been fundamentally found to be inconsistencies between the English language contracts that these commercial transactions are drafted under and Sharia law, which forms the basis of the transaction. There haven't been any of these conflicts, and therefore actually, doing Islamic business in this country is entirely compatible.
I mean, it's interesting that you say, you talk about this idea of doing Islamic business, particularly Islamic business in the UK and how it's compatible. One of the really differentiating factors about Islamic finance is that you have to be very picky about the type of business the business conducts. I mean, it can't be, say, in alcohol or some of the other things.
Yeah.
So bearing that in mind, is that not a conflict between the two frameworks?
Well, sure it is, but how much of a conflict really is that? I mean, we could talk about Muslim investors, we could talk about ethical investors. If you're an ethical investor but not a Muslim, do you really want to invest in tobacco and alcohol and other things that are harmful to society? I mean, that type of investor may not be Sharia compliant, but certainly shares a lot of universal values in common. So, sure, it restricts certain activities, but, my religious beliefs and those of many others prevent me from wanting to do business in those prohibited industries. And actually the data is very interesting because the data suggests that when financiers invest in businesses and industries that are far removed from, derivatives, for example, or types of financial instruments that may not be compliant with Islamic law or are highly leveraged.
Harris, hold that thought.
Yeah.
We have to go to a short break, but we'll pick that up for you. Okay, so when we come back, we'll be taking a look at the challenges Islamic finance faces in its continued development in the UK and exactly what needs to happen for it to become an effective alternative in London's highly competitive financial market. All this and more right after the break. Don't go anywhere. So. Hello and welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing Islamic finance growth rate in the UK and whether or not it's begun to stagnate. To continue the discussion, still with us is our guest today, Harris Irfan, a leading Islamic finance banker and author of Heaven's Bankers. So, Harris, let's talk about Islamic finance and education. I think, regardless of what sector it is, the level and quality of education on a financial foundational level has an effect on decades to come. Where is Islamic finance's education on perhaps, say, undergraduates, MBAs? Where are we at that level? Is it at the quality it needs to be?
We have a huge amount of interest in this country, and the UK has done very well to establish courses up and down the country at some of the leading universities on the subject of Islamic finance and the Islamic economic model. So it's actually one of the world's leading Islamic finance countries for education in Islamic finance. Now, that hasn't translated into jobs and job opportunities. It hasn't translated into large Islamic banks in this country. And there are other reasons for that. But certainly in terms of the intent and the strides that universities and other education facilities have made in this country to educate and to provide courses in Islamic finance has done a fantastic job. So there's a lot of interest and understanding of the subject matter at, undergraduate level.
I mean, you mentioned interest. It brings us a little bit back to what we said earlier about the sukuk being a drop in the ocean. Is the education that's come out of this sukuk investment from the UK, the government's interest in this, is this also a sort of token drop in the ocean? We should, there's a slight demand, therefore we should cater to it, or is it? Have they taken it seriously? Are educational establishments really taking the education of Islamic finance as not just an ad hoc thing that you do to your actual finance degree, but something that needs to be taken seriously as something that could be really transformational on a global level?
Look, I think that educational institutions have taken it seriously, but I don't think the financial institutions have taken it seriously. So you've got a problem, especially in the UK, where the British Islamic banks continue to recruit conventional bankers, individuals who don't have any background or even affinity with Islamic finance. Now, I'm not saying that they need to recruit Muslims, not at all. No, I'm saying they need to recruit people who understand the discipline, perhaps even believe in it enough to think that it's a good thing to buy a Sharia-compliant product for their own portfolio. But unfortunately, we have a situation in the UK and elsewhere, and other parts of the world, where Islamic banks have boards of directors and senior management who have very little interest or affinity in Islamic finance itself. So typically, they might be conventional bankers. Some of them might be looking for, their last job before their retirement, and they're looking for a cushy number and a nice annuity when their pension comes in. I'm afraid that's a tragedy.
Well, why do you think that, actual Islamic bankers, people who are versed in that context and also have that Islamic background, why aren't they necessarily pushing for exactly the thing that you're talking about?
A lot of the undergraduates I meet say, look, I'm really interested in this industry. Yeah. I want to join. What do I do? And the sad fact is, recruitment officers, typically senior managers in Islamic banks, are looking for a certain technical skill set. And they find that technical skill set amongst graduates of finance and accounting and banking and people who come from conventional banking institutions. They don't really think beyond that. So they don't look at a graduate who's come from an Islamic finance qualification and said, you know what, that's the kind of skill set and the kind of thinking that I'm looking for. So you've got this sad situation where a lot of these graduates are very bright, are very able. They've invested a lot of time and effort in understanding this industry, but they just can't find their way in. I think it'll be a generational change. I think as the old guard start to fall away, yes, and you start to see newer, younger, more sort of switched on, and they are more switched on, individuals coming through, then I think that will change.
Well, it's certainly one of the bigger challenges facing Islamic finance. On the topic of challenges, what other challenges are there Islamic finance faces? Because it's not, unfortunately, it's not just one. There are quite a few, so perhaps you can give us a summary on that.
We did talk about education, and I wanted to talk about education of the customer as well. Yeah. So we've seen some great initiatives in this country. Al Rayan Bank, for example, who used to be called Islamic Bank of Britain, they have YouTube videos, they have pamphlets, they try and educate the customer on what it means to be buying a halal mortgage, for example. And it's well explained, and it ought to be something that a customer would say, well, that makes sense, now I understand.
Harris, is it really though? I think, like you said, when you speak to students who want to find an entry into Islamic finance, they all ask the same question, very basic question in some terms, over and over again. Mm-hmm. Again, when you speak to people on the sort of the average person, perhaps a lot of the people that are watching at home, they ask the same questions over and over again. So there is this apparent push by some of these banks that are saying that we're really educating people, but is it really effective? Because people are asking the question.
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Well, actually, there's $2 trillion question. And I have a lot of sympathy for individuals who say, look, I understand when they say I went to get a halal mortgage and I went to an Islamic bank and they gave me a contract and it looked like they crossed the word out, they crossed the word interest out and written the word profit in, and I was paying more for it. So how is that ethical? How is that Sharia compliant? Well, I understand that, and I have sympathy for that. But we ought to understand that there is a form and there is a substance. And let me give you an analogy that one of the very famous scholars in this industry uses. It's somebody called Sheikh Taqi Usmani. Mm-hmm. He gives the analogy of two brothers. One of them sells alcoholic drinks in his shop and the other sells soft drinks in his shop. The brother who sells soft drinks observes the price of the brother who sells alcoholic drinks. And every time the price of the alcoholic drinks goes up 10%, he also raises his prices 10%. When they drop 5%, he drops them 5%. So he stays in lockstep so that there is no arbitrage between the two and there is a fair market. Now, the product that he's selling is halal. There's nothing wrong with it. But the benchmark he's using is from an industry which is not halal. And Islamic banking works in a very similar way because the benchmarks that it uses, such as the interest rate, which we call LIBOR, it's a mathematical calculation of how profit is earned on a Sharia-compliant contract. It doesn't mean that the contract itself is haram.
That's often a very contentious issue that is brought up, isn't it? And saying that, wait a minute, if you're comparing an Islamic product like the Islamic mortgage to a non-Islamic interest-based benchmark like LIBOR, you said, is it really halal? And you're saying that, of course, it's just a comparison, doesn't necessarily mean that it has an effect on the product.
We can use halal meat as another analogy. Halal beef versus non-halal beef. Does it look the same? Does it smell the same? Does it taste the same? But one has something very important. It's been sanctified. It is something that we are allowed to eat. Now, purely from a form point of view, it may not look very different, but it's very important that we understand there's also a form and a substance. So I think these are very important issues, and a lot of people say, well, how is it possible that, you know, the bank lends me £100,000 to buy a house, and if it's a conventional bank, I pay them 5% interest a year, but if it's a Islamic bank, I pay them 5% profit a year? Well, in many cases, the Islamic bank has actually taken more risk on that house by buying and taking title to it and then charging you a rental income. The conventional bank doesn't do that. There is a very different risk proposition there. So that's a very important difference, even though economically the cash flow is the same.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on the topic of retail, I'm interested in our non-Muslim consumer. Are these products, in short, in summary, are they applicable to them? I mean, is a non-Muslim consumer going to be interested in, you know, a more expensive no-interest mortgage?
Yeah, well, it may be expensive in this country because Islamic institutions here are small and therefore they have higher funding costs, generally speaking. But if you look at Malaysia, for example, probably almost half of Islamic banks' products are sold to Chinese non-Malaysians, which is a phenomenal figure because commercially it makes sense. It's a good product. It's competitive against conventional financial products. And that's the important thing. If you not only produce a quality and competitive product, and perhaps you might also inject something else into that, maybe talk about the ethics of that product, that it's related to the real economy, that it's related to real assets, you know, that it's an ethical product, that that bank doesn't invest in non-ethical industries. That's particularly for certain demographics like millennials, that's a very important consideration for them. They want to invest in industries. They want to buy products that are more ethical than others. Absolutely. That's a really important consideration. So if we widen Islamic compliance, Sharia compliance, to what we call ESG compliance, environmental, social and governance compliance, to widen the base of customers, so you're not just selling to non-Muslims, that's a huge growth story for the Islamic finance industry.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Harris. It's been a real pleasure, very, very insightful.
Thank you.
Sadly, our time is up, but thank you for joining us today. Throughout this series, we have explored many of the key aspects of Islamic finance with leading industry experts, such as Harris today, to give you at home some understanding of this complex but extraordinary sector. We hope it's been an insightful and enjoyable journey. And this, of course, is the last episode for this series, however. We will be back with another one soon. You can keep up to date with our progress by tweeting us at Islam Channel, or you can alternatively contact us via Facebook on islamchannel.tv with the hashtag The Islamic Finance Show. Now, all that remains for me to say is a huge thanks again to our guest, Harris Irfan. Thank you. Our guests that have been on the show, and of course, a big thank you to you at home for sharing this journey with us. We look forward to having your company again in the next series. And until then, take care and goodbye.